Let me begin in the name of the Lord, who is ever present. May all his blessings be on all of you. I first want to thank the Gender Equity Committee and the Asia Pacific Alliance for organizing this webinar, especially Sunita for all her communication, facilitation, and her team. They have done an excellent job. And I'm honored to be among such distinguished speakers and to be in your presence. I want to also thank Nam for his leadership. I find so many of the APE programs to be so meaningful, and this is no different. So I will begin my intervention. You know, when March 8th comes around every year, I'm asked to say a few words. And I was thinking about this year's theme and thinking about Women's Day. I thought how wonderful it would be for women to celebrate March 8th as a memory to overcoming dark day, a memorial of a past bad days, the days where they were discriminated against, abused, underpaid, violated, only because they were women. But alas, we're still fighting the same battles. The campaign theme of inspire inclusion also made me wonder, isn't it strange that in 2024, we must still create slogans to encourage people to include women in society, at workplace, in school, and in political life? Unless you're tempted to think and conclude that men alone are the cause of this exclusion, according to the World Bank, 95% of the people in 80% of the world's countries hold at least one bias against gender equity. United Nations calls gender equity the unfinished business of our time. They say gender equity, besides being a fundamental human right, is an essential to achieving peaceful societies with full human potential and sustainable development. Our own Vision 2030's pillar of just world is directly linked to this concept of human rights. I find it strange that women give life, love, sustenance. They make any abode a home just by being in it. They're caring, nurturing, yet most people hold a bias against them, women included. Gender stereotypes affect all of us. I remember when I first went to the US in 1976, my college advisor literally laughed at me when I shared that I wanted to go to medical school to become a neurosurgeon. He ridiculed my ambition. And he told me that if his child were in need of a neurosurgeon, he would never go to a woman surgeon, least of all a foreigner. He discouraged me from studying sciences even, which was a prerequisite for the entry to medical school. He said, you'll just become a chemistry lab old maiden. Of course, at that time in 1976 in the USA, there were only 4 women neurosurgeons. And that obviously tainted his judgment. But fast forward to 2024, and only 8% of all women doctors choose neurosurgery in the US. In Asia, incidentally, T.S. Kanka of India is considered to be Asia's first woman neurosurgeon. In 1968, she pioneered the deep brain stimulation kits, which she helped make available in affordable prices. And she also had set up her own hospital for the poor, and from her own earnings, she paid for everything. That's what women bring to any field: compassion, love, and yet, alas, equity is not at hand. In Asia and the Pacific region, women's equity faces many of the same hurdles as in other parts of the world, but there are also some challenges that are particularly pronounced in this region. cultural and traditional norms that often reinforce gender stereotypes and restrict women's autonomy and opportunities. Practices such as child marriage, female genital mutilation, and son preference perpetuate gender inequities and limit women's access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. And while progress has been made in improving access to education for girls in many countries in Asia and the Pacific, disparities still exist, particularly in the rural and marginalized communities. Barriers such as poverty, distance to school, and cultural attitudes towards girls' education hinder their enrollment and retention in school. The Institute for Development Studies found that in Asia and Pacific, there were 3 barriers to education: gender, wealth, and location. So poor girls from families in crowded urban settings or rural areas, least likely to have access to education. And that we have a lot of in Asia. Then there is the gender-based violence, including domestic violence, sexual harassment, and human trafficking that's prevalent in many countries in the region. Factors such as weak legal framework, social stigma, and lack of support services contribute to high levels of violence against women and girls. And in war and armed conflict zones, when social barriers break, this violence increases. And I'll say more about that in a minute. Women in Asia Pacific also face barriers to economic empowerment, including limited access to land, credit, and employment opportunities. In many countries, women are concentrated in low-paying and informal sector jobs and face discrimination in the workplace, including the pay gap between men and women. And underrepresentation in political leadership roles across much of Asia and Pacific are due to structural barriers such as discriminatory electoral systems, lack of support from political parties, and cultural norms that prioritize male leadership. Of course, figures like Indira Gandhi of India that came at a time to really change the landscape, not just of India, but of the world by declaring India non-aligned. And Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, who at 37 became a prime minister and changed the way she looked at or invited New Zealanders to look at women and their equity. And today, New Zealand has achieved perfect equity in their representation in their parliament. Political access and voting rights, although as we saw in the video, Nordic countries had bestowed right to vote to women, landowners, and local elections in the 1700s, the first country of the world to grant national voting rights to women was New Zealand in 1893. And that was followed by Australia in 1902 and the Grand Duchy of Finland in 1906. And it took until 2015 for the relentless advocacy of their women to lead Saudi Arabia to finally grant women the right to vote. And yet today, apart from the 4 Nordic countries of Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and the Pacific nation of New Zealand, where gender parity, as defined by equal participation in educational, health, economic, and political spheres, is almost complete, the rest of the world needs 134 years at this pace to breach the gender gap. And political underrepresentation is a direct result of that. Nelson Mandela said, as long as women are bound by poverty and as long as they are looked down upon, human rights will lack substance. And as long as outmoded ways of thinking prevail and prevent women from making a meaningful contribution to society, progress will be slow. Women's access to healthcare, particularly reproductive and mental health services, is another challenge for all the regions. And in light of the ongoing violence in Gaza, Ukraine, South Sudan, Haiti recently, and unfortunately many other flashpoints in the world today, it's inevitable to speak of women in war and conflict zones. When we examine justice within the context of women's empowerment, we're confronted with the stark reality that nowhere is the challenges and inequalities faced by women more apparent than in the war zone, where the rights and dignity of women are routinely violated and their bodies used to send political messages, as we see often with ethnically provoked rape in India, for example, unfortunately. According to UN Women, approximately 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence. And globally, 7% of all women have been sexually assaulted by someone other than a partner. In conflict-affected areas, these rates are even higher, with women and girls facing heightened risks of gender-based violence, including sexual assault, rape, and forced marriage. 4 years after the start of the conflict in Yemen, nearly 2/3 of all girls under the 18 are married. Some go into marriage as young as 3. And this is occurring everywhere. Between 2000 and 2018, more than 300,000 children, mainly girls, were married in the United States. Among the 50 states, only 10 have 18 as the legal age of consent for marriage. 5 states have no age of consent for marriage, and the rest fall somewhere between 5 and 17. According to the United Nations, every minute, 28 girls under the age of 18 are forced into marriage. Desmond Tutu famously said, when it comes to violence against women, there are few practices as harmful and as widespread as early marriage. Data from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, illustrates the dire situation facing women in war and conflict zones. Women and girls comprise a significant proportion of refugees and internally displaced, with their loss of security, which is their home that provides them and shelters them, increases their vulnerabilities and exposing them to increased risk of violence, exploitation, and trafficking. In these settings, the breakdown of social structure and the rule of law often leaves the survivors without any recourse. And it also, displacement disrupts access to essential services. UN estimates that mortality and malnourishment rates for women and newborn children are extremely high in the conflict zone, with 60% of preventable maternal deaths occurring in situations of conflict and displacement. 1 out of every 5 refugee and displaced women in humanitarian situations suffer sexual violence. It's probably underreported and underestimated because of lack of access. And girls are 2.5 times more likely not to be in school in conflict zones. Physical, verbal, sexual abuse, financial crisis. Financial crisis that's caused by situations of armed violence force women who are normally kept out of the labor market into the market. But this is where it's both a challenge and opportunity. There are complex and multifaceted ways in which conflict shapes women. Oxfam's Elizabeth Wood did a study, and I'll quickly mention what she found. She found that conflict led to significant transformation of role of women in society. And going back to neurosurgery, the first neurosurgeon in the UK in 1943 only took her job because no men were left in the hospital to do the job. So she became the first in all of Western Europe. And she even pioneered the procedure that eventually saved the life of the author A.A. Milne. You might know him from Winnie the Pooh stories. Despite hardships of the war, women demonstrate increased agency and participation in various aspects of society, and they show resilience in coping strategies. They help navigate the impact of conflict. So, faced with all these challenges, let's look at the opportunities. On the International Women's Day, on this International Women's Day, let's recommit ourselves to the fight for greater equality. Let us challenge gender norms, promote inclusion, and empower women to reach their full potential. According to the UN, with the right mix of economic and social policies, governments can generate decent jobs for women and ensure that the unpaid care work that goes into sustaining all economies is recognized and supported. As advocates for social justice and human rights, it's incumbent upon us to stand in solidarity with women in war conflict zones and amplify their voices. And it's crucial to recognize the pivotal role that gender equality plays in fostering peace and prosperity worldwide. Gender equality is not just a moral imperative, it's the best indicator to ensure peace over and above all other parameters, even above a country's level of democracy, wealth, or religious or ethnic composition. So together we can create a world where every woman and girl has the opportunity to thrive and live in harmony with self, with her community, in a just and inclusive world. Mahatma Gandhi famously saw women not as objects of reform and humanitarianism, recipients of more humane treatment by enlightened men, but as subjects who, if they chose, would become arbiters of their own destinies. And Maya Angelou said famously, each time a woman stands up for herself, without knowing it possibly, without even claiming it, she stands up for all women. So let us all choose to become arbiters of our own destinies. Let us be brave. Let us stand up for inclusion. And if you ever get discouraged by the slow pace of progress towards equity, I remind you of this Japanese proverb that says, be not afraid of going slowly. Be afraid of standing still. Thank you.